If you watch a lot of football, spend a lot of time reading about football or watching football YouTube videos, you've probably, which you probably do, given the fact that you're watching this one, you've probably heard a lot about PFF. And it's kind of hard to avoid PFF. And there's plenty of things that people like and dislike about PFF, many of which I think are fair, but there's some myths out there that I just don't know if they're totally fair. So I figured I'd give my 2 cents on just explaining and maybe helping you understand what they do a little bit more in both positive and negative senses. So myth number 1, they treat their grades as gospel. This is a myth. This is not true. They do not treat their grades as gospel. And if you listen to their podcast or hear what they have to say about things, they will constantly say, well, yeah, this guy was graded this way, but there's extra context in here, so it's actually not probably, I would still go with this other guy who has a slightly lower grade over this guy. They're all within context. I think PFF people in general, and I think one of the things that is important to always note is that just because something has an issue with it does not mean that it is wrong necessarily. I think it would get frustrating for me personally if I was looking at what PFF is saying, and every time they do it, they say, well, no, this guy had a 0.1 grade higher than, the other guy, so clearly he's better. Why would you go after the other guy? That doesn't really seem to be how it works. It always seems to be a ballpark thing, which I think is a better way to use it. I think sometimes people want a stat that can just full stop, tell them everything. But the reality is there just really isn't that stat out there, and there never is going to be. There's never going to be a perfect stat, and just because this one isn't perfect doesn't mean that you can necessarily criticize it, because the people there themselves also agree that it is not a perfect stat, and they will tell you, like, for example, when Kirk Cousins had a way too high PFF grade, they kind of say, yeah, but that was a bit misleading. He wasn't actually that good that year, which is why I think it's important thing to differentiate, as it is a tool to use, not the only tool to use. Myth number 2, they grade on plays where they don't know the plays. This is something that I hear all the time, which is, oh, you can't trust PFF. Because again, I use PFF grades on my videos a lot. It's just a tool that I use, and every time I do, people will, someone doesn't like it, and people will even bring up like, oh, they grade on plays where they don't even know what the play is. That's kind of true. I mean, the reality is you can't know what the play is unless you're in the huddle. So yes, there are times when they grade a play and they don't know exactly what the concept is, but you can say that about everything. When I make my videos, I don't know before I watch the play what the play is. I have to read it, watch it sometimes several times. Sometimes it takes me a bunch of times to watch it to fully figure out what's going on, and then I give my opinion. In fact, literally everyone other than people that are working in NFL buildings can have that kind of negative attribute, because we don't know. We have to watch and we have to figure it out. But they do not grade on plays where they do not know the plays, because that implies that someone might do their job correctly and they would give a negative grade, which, listen, it's human error. It can happen, but it's not something that's consistently happening. What the graders do is they grade on a player if they accomplished or didn't accomplish what they were trying to accomplish. If someone's trying to make a specific block, well, even if they actually screwed up their assignment, PFF doesn't know that, so they're not going to say that one way or the other. But if you make your block, they will give you a positive grade, and if you miss your block, they will give you a negative grade. And they're taught that if they do not know to play, if they can't figure out what it is, to just not grade it. That's totally fine to not grade it. There was a former NFL offensive lineman who went through and saw all of the graded, saw like over 100 plays that PFF graded, and said, like, no, there's maybe a couple I would grade slightly differently, because there is a matter of opinion, there is a bit of subjectivity to it, which can be seen as a negative, and fair enough, but it's not like they're just going out there and guessing, I guess is what I would say. Myth number 3, this is a big one. It's going to require a little bit of explaining, and it is other stats affect grades. Like, one thing I've heard is people talk about, oh, well, the dumb thing they do where when a pass is caught, the closest eligible receiver, he's the one who gets those yards given up against. That's so stupid. That's why you can't trust PFF. That does not affect their grades, though. So, for example, there is a stat, yards given up, which isn't a great stat, and they even acknowledge it's not a great stat. It's just one of the hundreds of stats they have on their website, and it's kind of an easy one to follow as a fan. But, if they're playing zone coverage and they're playing off coverage, and so a team just takes a check down and gains 10 yards on a 3rd down and 20. Well, the 10 yards have to go to somebody. They go to the linebacker who was in that area. They get 10 yards given up, but they didn't really do anything wrong on that play. Their grade would go up on that play because they came in and made a tackle and did their job, even though the other stat would be wrong. I think a similar thing is with a sack, for example. A sack has to get graded towards somebody on the offensive line, right? So they have to charge it to someone on the offensive line, even if an offensive lineman actually picked up what they were supposed to do with their blitz correctly. If something else happens, the blitz comes from that perspective, the sack will get charged to that player. Personally, this is why I don't look at PFF sacks and why I don't look at PFF yards. Those aren't stats that I find interesting, but it does not affect their grade, and it's important to, again, understand the context of what these stats are, because a lot of times what people complain about are things that PFF openly acknowledges and talks about within themselves. Myth number 4, but what about player blank? This is something we see all the time. You can't trust PFF grades because, look, they had this player higher than that player. This is something I used to say all the time. Again, I am not a PFF show. I am not paid by PFF, and I've been critical of PFF on this channel. In fact, there was a time when I did not like PFF early on in this channel. You can probably go back and find old clips of me making fun of them before basically they kept proving me wrong and making me look silly, and so I stopped doing that, and I started saying, okay, maybe you guys know what you're talking about. Plenty of grades that I've sat here and said, that grade doesn't make any sense. What are you talking about? I go back and watch the tape and say, okay, I see it. I see what you're doing there. I see why you gave that grade. Basically, that's what happened, is I kept doing that and kept, checking out to see if they knew something and realized, oh, they actually do. I don't agree with them on every grade. I don't agree with them in every game, but there's going to be disagreements. There is no perfect statistic, and that kind of leads us to our final myth. Myth number 5, something being flawed makes it worthless. This is something that with all the PFF stats, you can find holes in, because with every stat ever made, there are issues. The difference is, when we talk about passer rating, if I say, well, Tua had a higher passer rating than, some other quarterback, you're going to immediately say, well, yeah, but he had Tyreek Hill and he had Jalen Waddle. We already know the context of passer rating. We already know the flaws and why it's more of a team stat than it is an individual player stat. But the issue with some of these newer stats is, while those will have flaws, a lot of times smaller flaws, because we're not aware of what those flaws are, we think that it's a bad stat altogether, even though it might be a much better stat than the caveman style stats that we currently work with, like passer rating and passing yards and, interceptions instead of turnover worthy plays and all of that stuff. That's kind of the main thing, and part of why I use a lot of PFF stats when I make my videos, as opposed to using box score stats. Even though I will look at box score stats as well, I think PFF stats are much more accurate. The reality is, a PFF grade is the most reliable stat there is out there. It's still not perfectly reliable, but it's the most reliable single stat that we do have. I think there's plenty of good faith criticisms to have about PFF. That's kind of what I want to end on. One thing that I've always criticized is it sometimes feels like it's, and this is something I've talked about constantly on this channel, it often feels like what they do is more of a batting average than it is a slugging percentage, right? Like, let's say you miss a tackle on 2 straight plays, but on a 3rd play, you're able to create a play that results in a pick 6. Obviously, that was a net positive on those 3 plays, but your overall grade gets sent down. Now, I'm sure that they would argue that, there's a ton of luck that goes into creating a pick 6, and that's true, but again, it's why I still like the stat, but just because I have this flaw in it does not mean I would consider it a worthless stat, just something I take with a little bit more context on of, hey, maybe someone like Devin White, who I still think has a lot of issues as a player, maybe he's a little bit better than his grade because his kind of play style is he misses a lot of plays, but then he will get the splash plays. Although last year he was just bad. But, he's someone who, and I've always been closer on PFF's side with his bad grades than the public side of him being great. That's just where I've always ended up on. But I'm just used him as an example. There's other players like that. I think that's reasonable to talk about. But at the end of the day, if you keep disagreeing with a lot of PFF grades, the reality is they're going to be right a lot more than you are. At least that's my experience. I don't know. Maybe you're better at it than me. I'm better at it than them. But yeah, those are some issues I have with PFF, but also some myths that I think people should probably stop saying about PFF. Use it as a tool, right? I don't care about the people at PFF, whatever. Use it because I want us to have smart football conversations, and I want us to be able to talk about smart things, and that's what we can do if we use it as a tool. So yeah, that's what I think. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. Always love hearing from you. And of course, as always, thanks for watching.